We ask that you would be pleased to do this for your glory and for our good. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Now, last week, as we were looking at the summary section of the book of Judges in chapter 2, we looked at befriending sin. And we saw that Israel's descent into the depths of sin, it started when they formed a friendship with God's enemy, where they forgot and forsook God because they fell in love with the gods of the Canaanites. Israel, in other words, thought that they were handling something harmless, but in fact they were handling something very dangerous, something that threatens to destroy them. And I want to pick up where we left off last week to kind of prepare us by asking two questions. And it is this: if sin is so powerful and its poisonous influence can cause our hearts to stop beating for God, then why do we befriend it? And once we do, how do we stop loving it? See, why do we get near sin? Why do we tolerate sin? Why do we actually handle something that is so dangerous? I think there's at least two answers. Well, I'm only going to look at two answers. There's more, but I just want to look at two. The first reason why we befriend sin is because we think there's life found in it. We believe that it will satisfy us. We believe that it will make us happy. We believe that it will give us what we long for. So, plain and simple, we pursue and befriend sin because we desire and want it. And then the second reason why we befriend sin is because we really don't believe that it's an enemy. See, we don't see it as something dangerous. We don't see it as something that could take the spiritual life right out from us. We really don't believe that sin hates God and it hates you. We really don't believe that it seeks to destroy us by leading us away from God. So here's what I want us to see this morning and argue. The only way to stop loving and befriending sin is to see sin as an enemy and love God more. But to see our sin as an enemy and to love God more, God must show that He is greater and more powerful than our sin, and that is exactly what our text wants to show us. Now, when Rebecca was really young, I don't even know, 4 or 5 maybe, she had almost a week where she was sick. She had 3 straight days of 103 fever, and one night when I'm putting her down, she looks at me and she says, "Daddy, does God know I'm sick?" And I did what any good dad / pastor would do. I said, "Honey, what are your catechisms?" So we started going through her catechism questions. Question number 1, who made you? She says, God. I'm like, God, that's right. Second catechism question is, what else did God make? Answer, God made you and all things. Third question, why did God make you and all things? Because for His own glory. And then the fourth question is, well, how can you glorify God? By loving Him and obeying Him. Fifth one, why are you to glorify God? Because He loves me and He takes care of me. And then Rebecca looked at me and she asked, Daddy, will God still take care of me when I sin? I said, oh, honey, God takes care of you especially when you sin. That's the main point of our text. That is what our text wants to drive home to us. It wants to convince us that God is a greater friend than our sin. And the reason why is it's going to show us how God takes care of us, especially when we sin. And I am going to have you stand for the reading of God's Word. We're going to look at Judges 2, verses 11 through 23. And it's long, so don't buckle your knees. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. And then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity with their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this people has transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. This is the word of the Lord. All right, you may take your seat. Prayed, so we're going to jump in. Now, my daughter's question to me was really exposing her fear, wasn't it? She knew the catechism answer that God made her and that God takes care of her, but what she feared was that God would no longer love and take care of her when she sins. Her fear is really the fundamental fear inherent in all of us, isn't it? I mean, wasn't this the reason why Adam and Eve hid from God? Because they were afraid of God? And ever since then, that fear is inherent in all of us, where we begin to wonder, will God still love me when I sin? When God looks at me in my sinful condition, is it so ugly to him that he's going to reject me? Does my sin put my relationship with God in jeopardy? You see, will God reject and abandon me because I reject and abandon him? My goal this morning, I want to drive out that fear. I want to drive out that fear and convince you that the greatness of God's love is seen in how he takes care of us, especially when we sin. See, last week, what did we focus on? We focused on Israel's failures to follow God's command and drive out the ites, right? That's what we're going to call them from here on out, because I can't pronounce all of them. This week, we're going to look at how God responds to their failure, okay? The first question that I want to answer is this: why did God no longer drive out the ites? Why did he let them stay in the land? Well, in verses 21 through 22, it gives us the answer: to test Israel by them, whether they would keep the way of the Lord or not, as their fathers did. So, whenever you got to ask this question, did God not know? Did God not know whether Israel was going to follow him or not, keep his ways or not? So, if he does know, then what's the test? Well, look down to chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, which we didn't read. Now, these are the nations that the Lord left, to test Israel by them. That is, all in Israel who had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. It was only in order that the generations of the people of Israel might know war, to teach war to those who had not known it before. Now, if you remember back in chapter 2, verse 10, there was a whole generation that grew up without knowing the Lord, without knowing the God who redeemed them from their slavery to Egypt. Well, guess what? This is that generation now. The generation that did not know the Lord is the generation that's befriended God's enemies. They are the generation that forsook God and fell in love with the Canaanite gods Baal and Ashtoreth. This is a generation that thought doing what was right in their own eyes, without any regard for what is right in God's eyes, is harmless. We're just handling baby snakes, right? Well, here's what I want to argue. The test was not because God lacked knowledge of Israel. It's because Israel lacked knowledge of God. And Israel lacked knowledge of God's enemies. You see, Israel needed to learn something about God, and they needed to learn something about the ites. This generation needed to learn that the ites, they're not really friends, but in fact are a dangerous enemy that hates them and hates their God. In other words, this generation needed to learn war. They needed to learn how God is the only one who has the power to conquer their enemies. And isn't this what we need to learn as well? See, in order to stop loving and befriending sin, we need to clearly see it as an enemy and learn how to do battle with it. But in order to fight an enemy, you got to know your enemy, right? And that was my intent last week. I wanted to show you that sin, it may have the appearance of being a harmless baby snake, but it's really a baby copperhead that's filled with poison. That once it bites you, its poison gets into your veins, which gets to your heart and can stop your heart from beating for God. Sin has one goal, and only one goal, and that is to destroy you. And it does it by drawing your affections away from God towards something else. In other words, sin seeks to captivate your mind so that your heart becomes captured with something other than God. That's sin's strategy. Sin wants to capture your heart and enslave it. Why? So that you follow and obey its desires, so that you do what it wants. And Paul in Galatians 5:17 tells us what sin wants. It wants everything contrary to God. It desires everything contrary to God. That's why it's his enemy. As God's enemy, its strategy is to deceive you into thinking it is better than God. It seeks to deceive you into thinking that it, rather than God, can give you life. That it, rather than God, can satisfy you, can make you happy, can give you what you long for. Man, when I was a sophomore in college, it was the first time our family went on a real vacation, okay? I don't count going to see my grandparents in Pennsylvania or Minnesota as a vacation, okay? But my dad had so many miles on his, because he was a salesman, he had so many miles with the airline that he basically got a free trip for the whole family to go to Hawaii. And he took our family for their 25th wedding anniversary to Hawaii. And while we were in Hawaii, we went to Maui first, and then we went to Honolulu. And it was when we were in Honolulu that I was exposed to things I had not ever seen before. Let's just say that was my first time to see street walkers, ladies of the night, and scantily dressed. And I'm watching all of these people having so much fun at the bars, walking down the streets, all over one another. And I turned to my older brother and I said, man, I said, Jeff, as a Christian, do you ever feel like you're missing out? And he says, sin is like cotton candy, Pete. What do you mean? Well, when you look at cotton candy, it's big, isn't it? I mean, it's fluffy, and it looks like it's going to satisfy you and fill you up, right? But the moment you take a bite of cotton candy, what happens? It melts into nothing but granulars of sugar. And then if you were to eat cotton candy and only cotton candy, what would happen? You'd die. Right. Why? Because there's no nutritional value in cotton candy. And he said, Pete, sin is like cotton candy. It looks appealing. It looks like it's going to satisfy. But it has no nutritional value to fill you up at all. You see, sin will always leave you unsatisfied. I mean, it may be fun for a while, and I'm not denying that, okay? But it will never satisfy you to where you won't need it again. That's how sin captures you. That's how sin enslaves you to its power. You see, the lure and power of sin is that it promises so much, but it delivers so little. It leaves you with a constant need and desire for more. Haven't you discovered that yet? Because it cannot satisfy us, sin will only take. And it wants to lead into more and more sin. So instead of filling us, it always leaves us empty, wanting more. That's why it's so powerful. Look at its power. Look at the power it had over Israel in chapter 2, verses 17 through 19. After the Lord delivered them, what'd they do? They went right back to doing the same thing that enslaved them in the first place. They quickly turned aside from following the Lord. And then after the judge died, they would turn back and act more corruptly than before. So Israel did not just repeat their sin. They acted more corruptly than before. It got worse and worse. Sin had captured their hearts. It's exerting its power over them. And what's it leading to? More and more sin. See, sin doesn't want you to just sin once. It wants to enslave you over and over and over again and again and again. So what does this teach us about sin in our lives then? We can't conquer it on our own. You see, God left the ites in the land to test Israel so that Israel would look outside of themselves and cry out to God to deliver them. And that's what we have to learn as well, isn't it? We have to learn that we can't free ourselves from sin's power or its poisonous influence. Now, I don't know about you, but every time I've tried to stop sinning, I haven't been able to. Every time I vowed, I'll never do that sin again, I find myself doing that sin again. Even when I'm convinced it's an enemy. Even when I know it's wrong, I find my mind captivated by it, drawn to it, and then captured by its power. This is why we, just like Israel, need to learn that we cannot look to ourselves to defeat sin. We must cry out to God for a deliverer. We must cry out to one who is strong enough to destroy sin's power over us. We must cry out to someone whose beauty is more captivating than our sin, whose love is more satisfying than anything else. Look with me how God in this text wants to captivate you with his great love and convince you that he will take care of you, especially when you sin. Because we see it in this contrast between verses 14 and 16. And verse 16 is the key verse. It's the hinge verse on which this whole passage turns. See, the one who gave them into the hands of their plunderers in verse 14 is the one who delivered them from the hand of their plunderers in verse 16. Which, if you're tracking, you're like, that sounds contradictory, Pete. How can God rightly exercise his justice against Israel and then save Israel at the same time? I'm going to come back and answer that in a moment, but here's what I want you to think about. What is this contrast saying? The God who rightly cast down his sinful people is the one who graciously stoops down in order to lift his people back up. See, this is the most amazing thing in this whole passage, especially in light of verses 17 through 19. God sent judges to deliver his people in spite of their continual harlotry, in spite of the fact that they continue to abandon God and chase after other gods. Notice he does not just deliver them once, but every time they turn away from him. See, God does not save his people because they deserve to be saved. He saves them because they can't save themselves. Look at verse 18. Because in verse 18 we see why God continues to deliver a people that continues to turn away from him time and time again and again and again for over 350 years. And what is it? The very heart of God cannot stand to see his people suffer. Once he justly hands them over to their enemies and then they become afflicted and oppressed, what happens? The very heart of God is moved with compassion, moved with pity towards them. And again, how in the world can that be? Because you've got to understand what's happening. How can he simultaneously punish and save? That's the tension. The whole Old Testament leaves you hanging with that tension. And it is not fulfilled until Jesus comes. But here's the question that we have to ask, because this is what our text is basically at. How in the world can God be filled with anger and then filled with compassion at the same time? Because there's only one place where these contrasts meet. There's only one place where God's justice for sin and his love for sinners come together and meet in one place. And this is it. The mystery of God's anger and his compassion can only be solved at the cross, where God sends the true judge. And don't miss this. Not to deliver us time and time again and again and again and again and over and over and over, but once for all. See, the whole book of Judges is showing us that we need more than a temporary deliverance. We need a total deliverance, a complete deliverance. The fact that Israel has continually been held captive by sin's power, it reveals that they need a greater deliverer. They need a better, stronger judge who will not only conquer Israel's enemies, but would actually lead them back to God. Israel, in other words, needs a deliverer who cannot be captivated and captured by sin, but one who is completely without sin. They need a deliverer who is strong enough to free them from their enslavement to sin because he never did. They need a deliverer who is so great that he actually captivates their minds and captures their hearts with his great deliverance. So brothers and sisters, that one place where these contrasts meet, it's the only place that can calm your fears. And that one place is the cross. The place where our great deliverer paid our deliverance with his own blood. See, I want you to think about something that Jesus said. Oh, the last words that he said and what this means. What was the last thing he said on the cross? It is finished. Well, what work did he finish on the cross? Well, to understand that, we got to ask another question. Well, why in the world did he go to the cross in the first place? In Matthew 1:21, Joseph was told to name the baby Jesus. Why? Because he would deliver his people from their sins. So, how, though? How does he deliver us from our sins? Well, Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:21 tells us that God made him, Christ, who knew no sin, to be sin. Why? So that we might become the righteousness of God. In other words, what theologians call this, what happens on the cross, is what theologians call the great exchange, where all of our sin is put on him. So think about this. From the moment that Jesus' prayer was not answered in the Garden of Gethsemane, through his betrayal and abandonment by his disciples, all the way through his illegal trial, his torture, and then his humiliating death hanging naked on a cross. Through all of that, he's paying for all of our sin. Christ became sin and then suffered God's wrath for it. Why? So we wouldn't have to. Jesus was separated from his own Father. Why? So we wouldn't be. That's the first exchange. All of our sin on him. And then what's the second exchange? All of his righteousness on us. See, this is where, again, Christians only get a third of the gospel. He didn't just die for us. He lived for us. He perfectly obeyed the law because you can't. But he did it for us. So he fulfills the law. He lived a perfect, obedient life. In other words, he lived the life that we were required to live in our place. So the first exchange is what? God takes all of our sin and puts it on the one who knew no sin. But then he takes the one who knew no sin, he takes his perfect, righteous life and covers us with it like this robe covers me. So every time we sin now, our unrighteousness is covered by Jesus' righteousness. We now have Jesus' righteousness credited to our account, which means perfect righteousness, unlimited righteousness, which means your account will never go in deficit. Never. So, when that happens, what should it cause you to see? Stop trusting in yourself. Stop looking to yourself. Stop looking to other things, because they can't give you that. Cry out to God for a deliverer, and then trust that Jesus is that deliverer. See, when you do, then all of this exchange is given to you as a gracious gift. Which means God now views and treats you the way he views and treats his son. It means that God now views and treats you as if you are righteous. See, what's true of Jesus is true of all those who trust in Jesus. Sin's penalty has been fully paid, and righteousness has been fully achieved. All of the work necessary to deliver you from your sin has been accomplished. It is finished. Which means your deliverance is total. Your deliverance is complete. Your deliverance is irreversible and irrevocable. Brothers and sisters and friends, what more can God do for you to convince you that he's a greater friend than your sin is? Because only he can take care of you when you sin. By cleansing us with the blood of his Son and then covering us with his righteousness. Now, St. Paul's Episcopal Church in downtown Manhattan, it's a historical monument. It was built in the early 1700s, and it had one of the largest sycamore trees in the whole state of New York in the front of it. Well, on September 11th, 2001, the rector of St. Paul's heard a thunderous crash from his apartment as the Twin Towers fell. And he immediately knew, so is his church. But a few days later, when he was finally able to go to the church, he saw that the church was still standing. You see, St. Paul's Episcopal Church remained standing because that large sycamore tree in the front received the destroying blow of the debris that fell from the towers. And today, they've made the tree's root has been preserved in a bronze memorial. Jesus in John 15 said to his disciples, "There is no greater love than this, than a man would lay down his life for his friends." And what does he say next? You are my friends. God is indeed a friend of sinners. And what a